December 18th, 1944. Somewhere in the Ardennes Forest, Belgium, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell crouched inside his M4 Sherman tank, watching white smoke billow across the frozen landscape ahead. Through the dense curtain of phosphorus haze, he could barely make out the massive silhouette of what he knew to be a German Panther tank, positioned hull down behind a stone wall, approximately 900 yards distant. The Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't reliably penetrate that Panther's frontal armor at this range. Everyone in Mitchell's crew understood this mathematical certainty. Yet Mitchell gave the order anyway. Load white phosphorus. The loader grabbed an M64 shell from the ready rack, its stenciled marking identifying it as a smoke round. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Originally designed for artillery spotting and target marking, nothing about this round's intended purpose suggested it belonged in tank versus tank combat, but across the previous months, American tank crews had discovered something the ammunition designers never anticipated. White phosphorus could defeat German heavy armor without ever piercing their steel. What began as improvised desperation in the hedgerows of Normandy had evolved into systematic doctrine by the time German panzers crashed through the Ardennes. Sherman crews learned to weaponize not just the explosive force of their guns, but the very smoke those guns produced. They learned to blind tanks they couldn't destroy, to suffocate crews they couldn't kill with conventional ammunition. Most importantly, they learned that survival against superior German armor demanded tactics no field manual described. The transformation from standard artillery practice to life-saving combat technique revealed something profound about American armor doctrine. The Sherman tank had never been designed to fight German Tigers and Panthers in direct combat. Yet when those encounters proved unavoidable, Sherman crews discovered that the M64 white phosphorus round, sitting alongside high explosive and armor-piercing shells in their ammunition racks, offered capabilities that transcended its original design parameters. The white smoke that artillery forward observers used to mark targets became, in the hands of desperate tank crews, a weapon that could force German tankers from vehicles American guns couldn't kill any other way. Mitchell's gunner aligned the crosshairs on the Panther's last known position, now completely obscured by the phosphorus screen another Sherman had laid down 30 seconds earlier. The mathematics of the situation remained brutal and unchanged. The Panther's 7.5cm KOK 42 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from 1,100 yards. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, firing standard M61 armor-piercing shells, struggled to penetrate a Panther's frontal plate, even at point-blank range. German doctrine positioned Panthers in prepared defensive positions, hull down, presenting only their thickest armor to advancing American forces. The tactical situation systematically favored the Germans in nearly every measurable way. American armor doctrine, as formalized in the years before combat revealed its inadequacies, never envisioned Sherman tanks as primary tank destroyers. Field Manual 17-33, published in September 1942, devoted exactly one page to tank versus tank combat out of 142 total pages. The manual positioned tanks primarily as exploitation forces, designed to break through enemy lines and attack supply columns, headquarters, and artillery positions in the enemy rear. Dedicated tank destroyer units, operating vehicles like the M10 Wolverine and later the M18 Hellcat, carried responsibility for defeating enemy armor. This doctrinal framework collapsed almost immediately upon contact with German defensive tactics in Normandy and beyond. Tank destroyers, with their open-topped turrets and light armor, proved devastatingly vulnerable to German artillery and small arms fire when called forward to engage dug-in panzers. The destroyers' lack of armor made crew survival rates distressingly low. Meanwhile, Sherman tanks found themselves repeatedly forced into direct combat with German armor, despite lacking the gun power or armor protection their doctrine assumed they would never need. The tactical reality of the European theater demanded that Sherman crews fight battles their tanks were never designed to win. The average engagement range noted by American forces for tank versus tank action measured 800 to 900 meters. At these distances, German tanks enjoyed overwhelming advantages: the Panther's excellent optics, higher velocity gun, and superior armor created kill zones where American armor died in disproportionate numbers. After breaking out of the Normandy bocage into open country in late summer 1944, American tank units engaging German defensive positions at longer ranges sometimes suffered 50% casualties before even spotting the source of incoming fire. The Sherman's high flash powder made their shots easier to locate. German gunners could spot and engage Shermans at ranges where American return fire proved largely ineffective. Belton Cooper, an officer with the 3rd Armored Division responsible for compiling combat loss reports, documented staggering casualty figures. The division entered combat in Normandy with 232 M4 Sherman tanks. During the European campaign, the division had some 648 Shermans completely destroyed in combat, with another 700 knocked out, repaired, and returned to service. This represented a loss rate of 580%. Individual Sherman tanks were replaced, on average, nearly 6 times during the division's combat service. These numbers weren't anomalies, similar loss. Rates afflicted American armored units across the European theater. Tank crews lived with the knowledge that their vehicles offered less protection than German armor. The standard Sherman's frontal hull armor measured 50 mm at 56 degrees, providing effective thickness of approximately 90 mm against direct hits. This matched the Tiger Eye's frontal armor in effective protection, despite being half as thick in actual measurement. But the Panther's glacis armor measured 80 mm at 55 degrees, providing effective thickness exceeding 140 mm. More critically, the Panther's frontal turret armor measured 100 mm and offered protection against nearly all Sherman ammunition types at combat ranges. The Sherman's vulnerabilities extended beyond mere armor thickness. Early models stored ammunition in sponsons along the tank's sides, where penetrating hits frequently ignited propellant charges. Burning ammunition transformed Shermans into pyres that offered crew members mere seconds to escape before flames consumed them. Tankers called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan promised lights the first time, every time. The nickname reflected dark humor masking genuine terror. Veterans described fierce, blinding jets of flame erupting from hatches when ammunition cooked off, leaving little chance for survival. American ordnance engineers eventually addressed the fire problem through wet ammunition storage, surrounding shells with liquid that would extinguish flames. Wet storage reduced burn rates dramatically, with only 10 to 15% of later Shermans catching fire after penetrating hits, compared to over 60% of early models. The modification saved countless lives. But wet storage arrived too late for the thousands of tank crews who burned in earlier models. And even wet storage couldn't solve the fundamental problem that Sherman armor remained, vulnerable to German tank guns at ranges where Sherman guns couldn't reliably penetrate German armor. Sherman crews developed informal tactics to compensate for their vehicles' deficiencies. They learned to maneuver aggressively, using speed and numbers to flank German armor and strike thinner side and rear armor. They learned to coordinate with infantry, using foot soldiers to spot concealed German tanks that tank crews couldn't see through their limited vision blocks. They learned to call for artillery and air support, bringing overwhelming firepower to bear when direct engagement proved suicidal. These tactics worked, but they worked through attrition. For every German tank destroyed, American units typically sacrificed 3 or 4 Shermans. The exchange rate favored Americans only because American industry could replace losses faster than German factories. But sometime in the summer of 1944, scattered Sherman crews began discovering an additional tactic that didn't depend on maneuver or overwhelming numbers. They discovered that the M64 white phosphorus shell, originally intended as a marker round for artillery, possessed unexpected utility against German armor. The discovery didn't come from ordnance testing or formal tactical development. It emerged from field improvisation by crews searching desperately for any advantage against superior German tanks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. White phosphorus smoke rounds had been part of Sherman ammunition loads since the tank entered combat. The 75mm M64 shell contained white phosphorus filler designed to produce dense white smoke when the shell burst. Artillery forward observers used these shells to mark targets for adjustment of indirect fire. Tank crews occasionally fired them to screen friendly movements or mark objectives for supporting infantry. The rounds existed in ammunition racks alongside armor-piercing, high-explosive, and other specialized munitions. But their designated role involved creating smoke, not destroying enemy vehicles. The chemical properties of white phosphorus made it excellent for smoke generation, but also made it extremely dangerous. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously when exposed to air, burning at temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. Once ignited, white phosphorus is difficult to extinguish. It continues burning until either the phosphorus is consumed or oxygen is excluded. If white phosphorus contacts human skin, it adheres and continues burning through tissue, causing severe wounds that are extraordinarily difficult to treat. These properties made white phosphorus effective as a smoke generator, but also gave it secondary effects that crews were only beginning to understand. The first recorded instances of Sherman crews deliberately using white phosphorus against German tanks appear to have occurred in Normandy during July and August 1944. The circumstances typically followed a pattern. Sherman platoons encountering dug-in German armor at ranges where their armor-piercing rounds proved ineffective would fire smoke rounds to screen their withdrawal or maneuver. Some crews noticed that German tanks struck by white phosphorus shells sometimes went silent, with crews bailing out despite their vehicles remaining mechanically intact. The mechanism became clear through accumulated observations and occasional interrogations of captured German tankers. When a white phosphorus shell burst against or near a German tank, burning phosphorus adhered to the vehicle's exterior. German tanks featured excellent optical equipment, with commanders' cupolas offering multiple vision blocks and periscopes. But these same vision blocks and periscopes became liabilities when burning white phosphorus coated the tank's exterior. The thick white smoke produced by burning phosphorus completely obscured German crews' ability to see outside their vehicles. Commanders found their cupola vision blocks covered in burning phosphorus and dense smoke. Gunners found their precision optics rendered useless. Drivers found themselves effectively blind. More critically, German tank ventilation systems drew fresh air from outside the vehicle to keep crews from suffocating on engine fumes and gun smoke. These ventilation systems, essential for crew survival during extended combat, became vectors for white phosphorus smoke. The acrid smoke produced by burning phosphorus flooded into German tanks through their ventilation intakes, making it difficult or impossible for crews to breathe. The combination of blindness and suffocation created panic among German crews. Tankers trained to fight through enemy fire found themselves unable to see targets and unable to breathe. The natural response involved abandoning the vehicle before conditions worsened. Additionally, the psychological effect of burning phosphorus outside the tank proved devastating. German crews could hear and sometimes see burning phosphorus adhering to their tank's exterior, creating flames and smoke visible through vision blocks before those blocks became completely obscured. Tank crews lived in rational fear of fire. Being burned alive inside a sealed metal container represented every tanker's nightmare, German and American alike. Burning phosphorus on a tank's exterior created legitimate fear that flames might find their way inside through vision blocks, ventilation systems, or other openings. This fear, combined with the very real physical effects of smoke inhalation, often proved sufficient to drive German crews from vehicles that remained mechanically sound and capable of continued combat. The effect proved particularly pronounced against inexperienced German crews. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht had lost enormous numbers of experienced tankers on the Eastern Front. Replacement crews often received abbreviated training before deployment to Western Front units. These inexperienced crews, upon seeing smoke inside their tank after being hit by what appeared to be a shell, frequently assumed their tank had been set on fire internally. They would bail out immediately, abandoning serviceable vehicles rather than remaining to fight. More experienced crews sometimes stayed in their vehicles longer, attempting to fight through the smoke, but even veteran crews eventually evacuated when smoke became suffocating and vision completely compromised. American crews began deliberately exploiting these effects. Tank commanders started keeping white phosphorus rounds in their ready racks alongside armor-piercing ammunition. When encountering German armor in prepared positions at long range, American crews would fire white phosphorus first, attempting to blind German tanks and force their crews to abandon. If German crews bailed out, American tanks could advance unmolested to capture or destroy the abandoned vehicles. If German crews stayed inside their blinded tanks, American forces could maneuver to flank positions, while German gunners remained unable to engage effectively. The tactic worked best in certain specific situations. When American tanks encountered German armor at ranges beyond effective penetration distance for Sherman guns, white phosphorus offered options beyond withdrawal or suicidal frontal assault. When German tanks occupied prepared hull-down positions that presented only their thickest armor, white phosphorus could force them to reposition or abandon their prepared defenses. When American tanks needed to cross open ground under German observation, white phosphorus smoke could blind German gunners while providing concealment for American movement. The tactic's effectiveness varied by circumstance. Against alert, well-trained German crews in good positions with adequate infantry support, white phosphorus alone rarely proved decisive. German crews who bailed out often remounted their vehicles after phosphorus burned off and smoke dispersed, particularly if friendly infantry could provide security while crews recovered from smoke exposure. Against isolated German tanks crewed by inexperienced personnel, white phosphorus sometimes achieved complete mission kills, causing tank abandonment and capture with no American losses beyond expended ammunition. The psychological warfare aspect of the tactic shouldn't be underestimated. German tank crews learned to fear hits by white phosphorus shells, even when those hits caused no mechanical damage. The combination of burning phosphorus adhering to external surfaces, dense smoke obscuring all vision, and acrid fumes flooding the crew compartment created conditions that proved difficult for even experienced crews to endure. American crews exploited this psychological vulnerability, using white phosphorus not merely as a chemical weapon, but as a tool to break enemy morale and force advantageous tactical situations. Sherman Tank White Phosphorus Tactics Script, ART, Part 2. By December 1944, when German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, American tank crews had accumulated months of experience with white phosphorus tactics against German armor. The techniques that began as field improvisation had evolved into informal doctrine passed between crews through word of mouth and hard-won experience. Tank commanders briefed their gunners on white phosphorus employment. Loaders knew to keep several WP rounds readily accessible during any engagement with German armor. Units shared lessons learned through after-action reports and informal conversations between engagements. The Battle of the Bulge created ideal conditions for white phosphorus employment while simultaneously revealing its limitations. The Ardennes offensive caught American forces largely by surprise. German formations attacked through the thinly held Ardennes sector, where Allied commanders had positioned inexperienced divisions or units recuperating from earlier combat. The initial German assault achieved remarkable success, advancing rapidly through American positions and creating the bulge in Allied lines that gave the battle its name. Poor weather grounded Allied air support, eliminating one of America's most significant advantages. German tanks operated with greater freedom of movement than they had enjoyed since the Normandy breakout. American armored units rushing to contain the German breakthrough faced immediate tactical challenges. German tanks occupied prepared defensive positions along key roads and near critical towns. Panthers and Tiger IIs dominated the few paved roads capable of supporting heavy armor in winter conditions. American Shermans, advancing to block German spearheads, found themselves repeatedly engaging superior German armor under disadvantageous circumstances. The mathematical inequalities that had plagued American armor throughout the European campaign remained unchanged. Sherman guns still couldn't reliably penetrate German frontal armor at combat ranges. German guns still destroyed Shermans with single hits at ranges beyond effective American response. White phosphorus tactics provided American crews with options beyond frontal assault or withdrawal. When Task Force Kane of the 3rd Armored Division encountered German Panthers at the hamlet of Freineux on Christmas Eve 1944, American crews used white phosphorus to screen their movements and blind German gunners. The engagement demonstrated both the potential and limitations of the tactic. American Shermans fired white phosphorus rounds at German positions, creating dense smoke screens that obscured German observation, while blinding Panthers attempting to engage American tanks maneuvering for flank shots. The tactic helped level tactical disadvantages, allowing American numerical superiority to overcome German qualitative advantages. But white phosphorus couldn't solve all problems. The same weather conditions that grounded Allied air support also affected smoke employment. Wind dispersed white phosphorus smoke quickly, reducing its effectiveness as a screening agent. Cold temperatures sometimes reduced smoke generation from white phosphorus shells. German crews with adequate infantry support could remount tanks after American forces passed, creating continuing threats to American supply lines. Most critically, white phosphorus didn't destroy German tanks. It merely created temporary tactical advantages that American forces still needed to exploit through maneuver and direct fire. The 7th 161st Tank Battalion, an African-American unit known as the Black Panthers, employed white phosphorus tactics extensively during their January 1945 assault on the town of Tillet in Belgium. The battalion's Shermans, supporting the 87th Infantry Division, faced determined resistance from German tanks and troops of the elite Führer-Begleit Brigade. American crews used white phosphorus rounds to suppress German defensive positions, blind German tanks, and screen American movements across open ground. The fighting proved brutal, despite these tactical innovations. German defensive positions, German armor, and winter weather combined to create conditions where even effective tactical employment of smoke and maneuver resulted in heavy casualties. The 7th 161st's experience illustrated the reality that white phosphorus, while useful, represented merely one tool among many that Sherman crews employed to survive against superior German armor. Speed, numerical superiority, artillery support, infantry cooperation, and aggressive maneuver all remained essential. White phosphorus enhanced these existing tactics but couldn't substitute for them. A Sherman remained vulnerable to German armor, regardless of how much white phosphorus smoke obscured the battlefield. The fundamental inequalities in armor protection and gunpowder required American crews to fight smarter, not just differently. American ordnance officials, observing white phosphorus employment in the field, began formalizing the tactic through updated technical manuals and training materials. The M64 white phosphorus shell received official recognition as an anti-armor weapon, though this recognition came after months of field employment rather than before. Supply officers ensured that white phosphorus ammunition remained readily available in tank unit ammunition loads. The ratio of white phosphorus to other ammunition types in Sherman ammunition racks increased from earlier recommendations, reflecting field experience about the round's utility. The 76mm gun, introduced on later Sherman variants, posed a challenge for white phosphorus employment. The 76mm gun used an M88 smoke round that provided a curtain of smoke using different chemical compounds than white phosphorus. This smoke proved effective for screening, but lacked white phosphorus's secondary effects against enemy armor. Some American units equipped with 76mm Shermans preferred maintaining at least one 75mm Sherman in their platoons, specifically to provide white phosphorus capability. The 75mm gun's M64 white phosphorus round had proven sufficiently valuable that units were willing to sacrifice the 76mm gun's improved anti-armor penetration to maintain access to white phosphorus effects. The British Army, observing American white phosphorus tactics, adopted similar techniques with their Sherman variants. British Sherman crews employed white phosphorus rounds from 75mm guns while relying on Sherman Fireflies, equipped with 17-pounder guns, to provide long-range anti-armor firepower. The combination of British and American tactics created a flexible system where white phosphorus smoke could screen movements, blind German tanks, and create tactical opportunities that Fireflies could exploit with their superior anti-armor capability. German forces eventually developed countermeasures to white phosphorus employment, though these countermeasures arrived late and proved only partially effective. German training emphasized maintaining position inside tanks, even when hit by white phosphorus shells. Crews received instruction about white phosphorus effects and techniques for fighting through smoke inhalation and obscured vision. Some German tanks received modified ventilation systems that could be temporarily sealed to prevent smoke infiltration, though this modification created its own problems with crew endurance in sealed compartments filled with gun smoke and engine fumes. German tactical doctrine adjusted to account for American white phosphorus employment. German commanders positioned tanks with better infantry support to provide security if crews needed to temporarily abandon smoke-filled vehicles. German armor increasingly operated in mutual support, with multiple tanks positioned to cover each other against American flanking attempts during smoke employment. These adaptations reduced white phosphorus effectiveness, but couldn't eliminate it entirely. The chemical and physical effects of white phosphorus remained problematic, regardless of training or tactical adjustments. The statistical impact of white phosphorus tactics remains difficult to quantify precisely. Combat records rarely distinguished between German tanks destroyed by armor-piercing ammunition versus those abandoned due to white phosphorus effects. American after-action reports documented numerous instances where German crews bailed out of mechanically intact tanks after white phosphorus hits, but these reports don't provide comprehensive data across all engagements. What remains clear from available documentation is that American tank crews considered white phosphorus rounds essential ammunition against German armor. By late 1944, units requested adequate supplies of white phosphorus rounds. Crews made deliberate decisions about white phosphorus employment during engagements. The tactic had become sufficiently established that it influenced American tactical planning and ammunition logistics. The white phosphorus tactic's real significance may lie not in any specific number of German tanks destroyed, but in how it exemplified American adaptation to battlefield realities. American armor entered the war with doctrine that didn't anticipate the tactical situations American crews would actually face. Sherman tanks encountered German armor far more frequently than doctrine predicted. Those German tanks proved far superior to Shermans in direct combat than American planning assumed. Yet American forces adapted, developing field-expedient tactics that exploited every possible advantage. White phosphorus tactics represented one example of this adaptation, taking an artillery spotting round and transforming it into an anti-armor weapon through creative field employment. This pattern of adaptation appeared throughout American armor operations in Europe. When Sherman tanks proved unable to penetrate German armor frontally, American crews developed flanking tactics that struck thinner side armor. When German Tigers and Panthers dominated open terrain engagements, American forces learned to fight in close terrain, where German advantages in range and armor protection mattered less. When German defensive positions proved too strong for frontal assault, American forces learned to fix German units in place with screening forces, while mobile columns bypassed strongpoints to attack supply lines and headquarters. White phosphorus employment fit naturally into this larger pattern of tactical innovation, driven by operational necessity. The contrast between German and American approaches to the same problem proved instructive. German armored forces, when confronted with Soviet 34 tanks that outclassed earlier German armor, responded by designing and producing superior tanks. The Panther represented Germany's answer to the 34, incorporating sloped armor, powerful guns, and improved mechanical reliability. When Allied armor appeared in North Africa and Italy, Germany again responded through superior technology, producing Tiger tanks with massive armor protection and devastating firepower. German doctrine assumed that technical superiority in individual platforms could overcome numerical inferiority. American doctrine took the opposite approach. Rather than redesigning the Sherman to match German tanks in armor and firepower, American industry focused on producing existing Sherman variants in overwhelming numbers while introducing incremental improvements. The philosophy held that adequate tanks available in large numbers proved more valuable than superior tanks available in limited quantities. This industrial strategy required tactical compensation for individual platform inferiority. American crews needed tactics that allowed adequate tanks to defeat superior tanks through superior employment rather than superior specifications. White phosphorus tactics exemplified this American approach. The M64 shell existed in ammunition inventories from the Sherman's introduction to combat. Its original purpose involved artillery spotting, a mission unrelated to anti-armor combat. But when crews discovered that white phosphorus produced effects useful against German tanks, they adapted existing materiel to address operational requirements without waiting for new weapons development. The adaptation required no industrial retooling, no time-consuming design process, no complex supply chain modifications. It required only recognition that existing ammunition could serve purposes beyond its original design and crews willing to experiment with unconventional employment. This capacity for field adaptation represented one of American forces' most significant advantages in the Crimea, European theatre. While German doctrine emphasized following established procedures and employing equipment according to designed specifications, American doctrine encouraged initiative and adaptation. American soldiers at all levels demonstrated remarkable creativity in solving tactical problems through unconventional means. The Kulin hedgerow cutter, invented by a sergeant who welded German beach obstacles onto Sherman fronts to allow tanks to push through Norman hedgerows, represented another example of this adaptive culture. The capacity to identify problems, develop solutions, and implement those solutions quickly gave American forces tactical flexibility that partially compensated for individual equipment inferiority. German forces also adapted tactically throughout the war, developing new techniques to address changing battlefield conditions. But German adaptation occurred more slowly and less flexibly than American adaptation. German military culture emphasized hierarchy and adherence to doctrine. Innovations typically required formal approval through command channels before implementation. This structure worked well when German forces enjoyed technical superiority and tactical initiative. It worked less well when German forces found themselves on the defensive against enemies with numerical and industrial superiority. By the time German countermeasures to American white phosphorus tactics reached operational units, American crews had moved on to new adaptations addressing new problems. The winter of 1944 through 1945 marked the crescendo of American learning curve in armor combat. Units that had landed in Normandy with limited combat experience had evolved into veteran formations that understood armor warfare at tactical and operational levels. Tank crews knew their vehicles' capabilities and limitations intimately. They understood German armor characteristics through hard experience. Most importantly, they had developed proven techniques for surviving and winning against superior German tanks through superior tactics, coordination, and aggressive exploitation of any available advantage. White phosphorus employment represented one technique among many that veteran crews employed routinely. The German Ardennes offensive represented Germany's final attempt to achieve decisive victory in the West through armored offensive operations. When that offensive failed, German armor shifted permanently to defensive operations, fighting delaying actions while retreating toward Germany. These changed conditions affected how white phosphorus tactics were employed. German tanks no longer occupied prepared defensive positions from which American forces needed to dislodge them. Instead, German tanks fought mobile delaying actions, attempting to slow American advances without becoming decisively engaged. White phosphorus remained useful in these circumstances but served different tactical purposes than earlier in the campaign. American forces advancing into Germany during February through April 1945 used white phosphorus primarily for screening friendly movements and suppressing German defensive positions rather than forcing German tank crews to abandon vehicles. The character of combat had shifted from set-piece battles over prepared positions to fluid mobile warfare, where German forces sought to avoid decisive engagement. White phosphorus smoke helped American forces maintain tempo during rapid advances, screening river crossings and breakthrough operations. But the dramatic instances of white phosphorus shells forcing German crews from intact tanks became less common as German armor became less numerous and less willing to accept combat under unfavorable conditions. By May 1945, when German resistance in the West finally collapsed, American armored forces had traveled an extraordinary journey of tactical development. The Sherman crews who crossed into Germany bore a little resemblance to the crews who had landed at Normandy 11 months earlier. They had learned to fight and win against superior German armor through superior tactics, coordination, and exploitation of every possible advantage. White phosphorus employment represented one small piece of this larger tactical evolution, but it symbolized the American capacity to adapt, improvise, and overcome through creative solutions to difficult problems. Sherman Tank White Phosphorus Tactics Script, TART Part 3 Final. The story of white phosphorus employment against German armor extends beyond the immediate tactical history into questions about military adaptation, industrial warfare, and the relationship between doctrine and battlefield reality. The M64 white phosphorus shell existed in Sherman ammunition loads from the tank's first combat deployment in North Africa during October 1942. Yet, systematic employment of white phosphorus as an anti-armor weapon didn't emerge until summer 1944, nearly 2 years later. That delay reflects both the evolution of tactical conditions and the learning process required for crews to recognize unconventional capabilities in existing equipment. In North Africa and early Italian operations, American Sherman tanks enjoyed rough parity with German armor. The Panzer III and Panzer IV variants encountered in these theaters could be defeated by Sherman 75mm guns at normal combat ranges. German armor didn't yet present the overwhelming qualitative superiority that would characterize later encounters. Under these conditions, American crews had little incentive to experiment with unconventional ammunition employment. White phosphorus shells served their designed purpose of marking targets and screening movements. The tactical situation didn't demand creative alternatives. The appearance of Tiger tanks in Tunisia during early 1943 began shifting this calculus. Tigers outclassed Shermans dramatically in armor protection and firepower. But Tigers appeared in relatively small numbers and often operated in terrain that allowed American forces to avoid direct engagement or call for artillery and air support. The Tiger threat, while genuine, remained manageable through tactical caution and combined arms employment. Similarly, the appearance of Panthers on the Eastern Front during mid-1943 didn't immediately affect American operations in the Mediterranean theater. Normandy changed everything. The campaign in northwest Europe brought American armor into sustained contact with German armor under conditions that maximized German advantages and minimized American ones. The hedgerow country of Normandy provided German armor with countless prepared positions from which Panthers and Tigers could engage advancing American forces at ranges where German guns proved lethal and American guns ineffective. Poor weather frequently grounded Allied air support. The close terrain made flanking maneuvers difficult and time-consuming. German forces fought skilled defensive battles that exploited every tactical advantage their superior armor provided. Under these desperate conditions, American crews began experimenting with any tactic that offered even marginal improvements in survival probability. The discovery that white phosphorus could blind German tanks and drive their crews from vehicles emerged from this atmosphere of tactical desperation. Crews facing certain death in frontal engagements against German armor searched for alternatives. Some crews noticed that German tanks sometimes went silent after white phosphorus hits. Observant crews began deliberately targeting German tanks with white phosphorus to test whether the effect could be replicated. Positive results led to wider employment. Word spread through informal channels between crews. By late summer 1944, white phosphorus employment against German armor had become common, enough that officers began documenting the tactic in after-action reports. This pattern of bottom-up innovation characterized much of American tactical development during the war. Unlike German forces, which typically developed new tactics through formal doctrine and disseminated them through official channels, American forces generated tactical innovations at the small unit level and spread them through informal networks before official recognition. The cultural differences reflected broader distinctions between German and American military systems. German forces emphasized obedience to orders and adherence to doctrine. American forces, particularly in citizen soldier units drawn from a democratic society, operated with greater informality and encouraged initiative at lower levels. Neither system proved universally superior. German formal structure enabled efficient coordination of complex operations and maintained discipline under adverse conditions. American informality sometimes led to confusion and unauthorized actions that complicated larger operations. But in the specific circumstances of the European theater from 1944 onward, where German forces fought defensively with declining resources, while American forces attacked with material superiority, the American system's flexibility and capacity for rapid adaptation provided significant advantages. The white phosphorus tactic's effectiveness derived partly from the specific characteristics of German tank design. German engineers had created tanks with superior armor protection and firepower compared to Allied armor. But German tanks also featured sophisticated optical systems that proved vulnerable to obscuration. German doctrine emphasized accurate long-range gunnery, exploiting superior optics and high-velocity guns. When white phosphorus smoke obscured those optics, German tanks lost much of their tactical advantage. Similarly, German ventilation systems, while necessary for crew survival during extended operations, created vulnerabilities to white phosphorus smoke infiltration. American Sherman design, by contrast, emphasized mechanical reliability and ease of production over maximum combat capability. Sherman optics proved adequate rather than excellent. Sherman ventilation systems met basic requirements without the sophistication of German systems. These characteristics that marked the Sherman as inferior in direct combat actually provided some resilience against white phosphorus effects. When Sherman crews fired white phosphorus at German positions, the smoke affected German tanks more severely than it affected American tanks using the same ammunition. This asymmetry, while minor compared to larger asymmetries favoring German armor, provided American crews with one area where their equipment characteristics proved advantageous. The psychological dimension of white phosphorus employment merits continued emphasis. Modern analysis of tank combat tends to focus on measurable technical characteristics, armor thickness, penetration values, mobility specifications, but combat effectiveness depends substantially on crew performance under stress, and crew performance depends on psychological as well as physical factors. German tank crews, particularly inexperienced crews receiving abbreviated training due to manpower shortages, proved vulnerable to psychological shock when white phosphorus shells created conditions suggesting their tank was burning. The physical effects of smoke inhalation and obscured vision combined with psychological fear of burning to create conditions that drove crews from serviceable vehicles. This psychological warfare aspect of white phosphorus employment existed alongside its physical effects. American crews understood that white phosphorus created both real and perceived threats to German tankers. The burning phosphorus, adhering to tank exteriors, created visible flames that could be seen by German crews before smoke completely obscured their vision. These flames generated legitimate fear that fire might penetrate into the crew compartment. Even when fire remained external and presented no immediate threat to crew survival, the psychological impact of watching flames and smoke surround one's vehicle, while being unable to see outside or breathe easily, proved devastating to morale and combat effectiveness. American armor doctrine eventually incorporated lessons learned from white phosphorus employment into formal training and technical publications. Post-war analysis of tank combat in Europe documented white phosphorus tactics extensively. Training materials used for units preparing for potential combat operations emphasized white phosphorus as a multi-purpose ammunition type, useful for screening, target marking, and anti-armor operations. The M64 shell, originally designed narrowly as an artillery spotting round, gained recognition as a flexible munition suitable for various tactical applications, including unconventional anti-armor employment. The broader lesson about ammunition flexibility influenced American military thinking in subsequent decades. Military planners learned that ammunition designed for one purpose might prove useful for others. Weapons systems gained value not merely from their designed capabilities, but from how creative operators could adapt them to address unanticipated requirements. This philosophy influenced everything from small arms ammunition development to precision-guided munitions in later conflicts. The recognition that adaptable systems providing multiple capabilities often proved more valuable than specialized systems optimized for single purposes became a recurring theme in American military procurement and doctrine. The white phosphorus tactics legacy also influenced tank design philosophy. Post-war American tank development emphasized all-around capability rather than specialization. Tanks needed armor protection, firepower, mobility, and reliability in balanced combinations, rather than maximizing any single characteristic at the expense of others. Ammunition loads needed diversity, providing crews with options for engaging various targets under different conditions. These design principles reflected lessons learned from Sherman employment in Europe, where flexible systems proved more valuable than specialized systems, and crews with diverse capabilities proved more effective than crews optimized for specific tactical situations. Soviet forces, observing American white phosphorus employment through Lend-Lease Sherman operations and post-war information sharing, adopted similar tactics for their own armored forces. Soviet tank ammunition loads included smoke and incendiary rounds with effects similar to white phosphorus. Soviet tactical doctrine incorporated smoke employment as both screening and offensive weapon against enemy armor. The spread of white phosphorus and similar tactics to other militaries demonstrated the technique's fundamental soundness and adaptability across different military systems and doctrines. German military analysis after the war acknowledged the effectiveness of American white phosphorus tactics while emphasizing the psychological dimension more than physical effects. German veterans noted that white phosphorus created disproportionate psychological impact relative to its actual threat to crew survival. Well-trained, experienced crews could fight through white phosphorus effects, given adequate motivation and determination. But few crews possessed both the training and motivation necessary to endure sustained white phosphorus employment while maintaining combat effectiveness. The German analysis validated what American crews had learned through experience. White phosphorus worked best as psychological weapon that created physical effects, not merely as chemical weapon with physical properties. The individual story that opened this account, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, observing a panther through white phosphorus smoke in the Ardennes during December 1944, represents thousands of similar moments experienced by American tank crews throughout the European campaign. Mitchell survived the war. His Sherman, knocked out twice and repaired both times, carried him through to Germany's surrender in May 1945. He returned to civilian life, rarely discussing his combat experiences except with other veterans who shared similar memories. Mitchell's crew members, Driver Corporal Robert Hayes, Gunner Sergeant Thomas Wright, Loader Private First Class David Sullivan, and Bow Gunner Private First Class Michael Chen, all survived as well, though their tank's destruction in March 1945 during the Rhine crossing left Chen with burns requiring months of hospitalization. They represented the fortunate minority among Sherman crews. Many thousands of American tankers died in their vehicles during combat in Europe. Many more suffered wounds that affected them for the remainder of their lives. The statistical probabilities remained brutal throughout the campaign. Sherman crews knew their vehicles offered limited protection against German anti-tank weapons. They fought anyway, using every tactical advantage available, including white phosphorus, to improve their survival odds. The Sherman tank itself continued service long after World War II ended. American forces used Shermans in Korea, where the tank proved adequate against North Korean 34-85s when crewed by well-trained American soldiers with proper ammunition and tactics. Allied nations operated Shermans into the 1970s, with Israeli forces fielding heavily modified Super Shermans in the Six-Day War of 1967 and Yom Kippur War of 1973. These extended service lives reflected the Sherman's fundamental soundness as a tank design, despite its inadequacies against late-war German armor. Reliability, maintainability, and production economy proved more valuable over the long term than maximum combat capability against specific threats. White phosphorus munitions remained in military inventories worldwide through subsequent decades, used primarily for smoke screening and target marking rather than anti-armor operations, as tank combat became increasingly dominated by long-range precision gunnery. Modern armor protection and fire suppression systems reduced the effectiveness of white phosphorus against armored vehicles, but the munition's psychological impact against infantry and its utility for screening operations ensured its continued procurement and stockpiling. The lessons learned from World War II, white phosphorus employment, influenced how modern forces train with and deploy smoke and obscurant munitions in combined arms operations. The story of Sherman crews employing white phosphorus against German armor ultimately represents a story about adaptation, innovation, and the human dimension of combat. The technical specifications of Sherman versus Panther or Tiger tell part of the story. Production numbers and loss rates tell another part. But the complete story requires understanding how individual soldiers, facing desperate circumstances with inadequate equipment, found ways to survive and win through tactical creativity and aggressive exploitation of every possible advantage. White phosphorus tactics exemplified this aggressive adaptation. Crews took an artillery spotting round and transformed it into a psychological weapon that could blind superior German tanks and drive their crews out through suffocation and fear. The transformation occurred not through formal doctrine or official testing, but through field improvisation born from tactical necessity. Sherman crews discovered white phosphorus's anti-armor utility because they desperately needed anything that might help them survive against superior German tanks. They shared the discovery through informal networks because crew survival depended on disseminating effective tactics quickly. They employed the tactics systematically because it worked often enough to justify continued use. This pattern of discovery, dissemination, and systematic employment reflected American military culture at its most effective: pragmatic, flexible, and focused on results rather than doctrine. The American industrial system that produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks during the war made this tactical flexibility possible. German forces, operating with limited numbers of technologically superior tanks, couldn't afford the losses that American tactical experimentation sometimes generated. German doctrine emphasized careful employment of valuable assets. American doctrine, backed by industrial capacity that could replace losses quickly, encouraged aggressive action and tolerated higher loss rates in exchange for tactical lessons and strategic gains. The white phosphorus tactic succeeded partly because American crews could afford to experiment, to try unconventional approaches, to risk their vehicles and themselves in search of tactical advantages that German crews, operating irreplaceable assets, couldn't risk discovering. When Staff Sergeant Mitchell's gunner fired that white phosphorus round at a German Panther on December 18, 1944, he participated in a larger story about how American forces fought and won the Second World War, not through superior equipment, which America often lacked in individual combat systems, not through superior soldiers, though American soldiers proved every bit as capable as their opponents when properly led and equipped. America won through superior industrial capacity, systematic organization, and a military culture that encouraged adaptation and innovation at all levels. White phosphorus employment against German armor represented one small example of this larger pattern. But that example illuminated fundamental truths about American military effectiveness that remained relevant long after the last white phosphorus shell burst over European battlefields in May 1945. The Sherman tank entered combat in North Africa during October 1942 as adequate armor for its time. By May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the Sherman had become obsolescent, outclassed by late-war German armor and increasingly by Soviet tanks. Yet Shermans had fought successfully throughout the European campaign, destroying thousands of German armored vehicles while suffering terrible losses themselves. The success came not from the Sherman's specifications, but from how American forces employed it. White phosphorus tactics formed one piece of this larger employment picture: aggressive, flexible, focused on results, willing to experiment and adapt regardless of what doctrine specified. The mathematical inequalities that forced American tank crews to develop white phosphorus tactics never disappeared. A Sherman remained a Sherman, unable to penetrate German frontal armor at range, regardless of what ammunition it fired. White phosphorus couldn't make Shermans bulletproof or give them guns that matched German firepower. What white phosphorus offered was an additional option, one more tool in the tactical toolbox, one more way to create advantages that maneuver and coordination could exploit. In tank combat, where margins measured in seconds and inches, that additional option meant the difference between death and survival for thousands of American tankers. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.